Alright children, welcome back. Today we're going to be learning about the loanable funds market. This is a graph. This is a simple market, just like your regular old supply and demand we were learning before, except now it's the supply of loanable funds. And what that means is money that can be loaned out. And then it's the demand of loanable funds, money that can be loaned out. We're still talking about quantity down here in the bottom right hand corner, but now it's the quantity of loanable funds. Again, money that can be loaned out. And then our price of a loan is going to be the real interest rate. So we're not just doing regular price anymore. Now we're doing the real interest rate, which is the price of a loan or the price of borrowing money. We're going to label our real interest rate capital I because it's the real interest rate. Later on we'll have a graph that has the nominal interest rate, and that will be a lowercase I. So I want you to be labeling this capital I every single time. All right. Supply and demand, again, this is regular old supply and demand, except now instead of talking about cookies or hamburgers, we are now talking about loanable funds, again, money that can be loaned out. So first, let's think about supply. Where does a loan come from? Well, it comes from savings. So it's going to be made up of people's savings account. The money that is sitting in someone's bank account is going to be money that can be loaned out. The savings is also going to come from lenders. Not only does the money have to be there, available to be loaned out, but it also has to be loaned by the lender. Now, in the loanable funds market, it's not just banks that do this lending, but we can just kind of think of it like that way for now and build off of that. All right, the demand for a loan. If you're demanding a loan, you're borrowing money. So we're going to call the demanders of loans borrowers. People that, oh no, I spelled that wrong. People that demand loans are going to be borrowers. Okay, so we've got the supply, which is made up of savers and lenders, and the demand, made up of borrowers. Pretty simple so far, although there are things that cause supply curve to shift and the demand curve to shift. We can talk about supply first. The first sector of the economy that affects the supply of loanable funds is going to be the household sector. Essentially, this part of the supply of loanable funds is going to be made up of people like you and me, the household sector that save money. When we save money in a bank account, that money can now be loaned out by that bank. So if people in households save more money, the supply curve for loanable funds is going to shift to the right, and now there's more money that can be loaned out. That's going to cause the real interest rate to decrease. It's going to become cheaper to borrow money. The real interest rate is going to decrease. So if people like you and me start saving more money in our bank, it's going to become cheaper to borrow money. That's going to be good for businesses. That will cause them to want to increase their borrowing. So this would be a good thing that would cause an increase in investment spending probably. Businesses would probably take this time to purchase more capital goods because it'll be cheaper because people like us, the households, are saving more money. Another sector of the economy that's going to be affecting the supply of loanable funds is going to be firms, aka businesses. So this is the private sector. This is the part of the economy that is made up of all of our businesses, aka firms. If businesses have money in the bank, then that money can be loaned out. So if businesses increase the amount of money that they're saving in the bank, the supply of loanable funds is going to shift to the right. If they decrease the amount of money that they're keeping in the bank, the supply of loanable funds will shift to the left. It's as simple as that. The government, this way is a little bit different. Generally, if we see the government engaging in savings, we're just going to see an increase in the supply of loanable funds for government. The supply will shift to the right as the government saves money or has money available to be loaned out. This is going to happen under a specific circumstance. This is when the government is in a budget surplus. When taxes are high, government spending is low, and so the government has extra money sitting around. Well, that money can be loaned out. So that will cause the supply curve of the loanable funds market to shift to the right, and it will now be cheaper to borrow money because the government isn't borrowing money, if that makes sense. The government's not borrowing money, they have extra money sitting around, so the real interest rate is going to decrease. That's how the government engages in savings, or in the supply curve. When we're talking about the rest of the world, that ROW, that stands for the rest of the world, and that's going to be our foreign sector. This is when foreigners either increase either when foreigners pool their money into our country and put it in our banks, or remove their funds from our country and take them out of our banks. If we have an increase in financial capital, we're going to call this financial capital inflow. So if we have an increase in capital inflow, it will look like this. This could be caused by a bunch of different things. That's the wrong Q1. All right, this is called capital inflow. Capital inflow is when foreign investors bring their funds to our country. They take their capital funds, it's like the money that they have in the bank, and they put it in our banks in an attempt to earn more money. Reasons for doing this: foreigners will want to put their money in our banks if they think that they're going to be able to get a higher return on their investment. So if the real interest rate is higher here than it is in Japan, people in Japan will want to put their money in the bank here because you get paid interest for leaving your money in the bank. So if the real interest rate is higher and you're going to earn more money for leaving your money in the bank in the United States, well, foreigners will want to put their money into the United States, and they'll be able to earn a higher return on their investment, a higher rate of interest. That's a reason why capital inflow would occur. On the other hand, capital outflow can also occur. If foreign investors start pulling their money out of our banks and take it out of the country, then the supply of loanable funds will shift to the left. There'll be less money available to be loaned out, which will drive up our real interest rate, and that'll be bad for like investment spenders, businesses that want to do investment spending. It's going to make it harder for them to buy capital goods because the cost of borrowing money is going to increase. So this is capital outflow. This is when foreign investors pull their money out of the country for any reason. Generally, it's going to be because maybe they don't think the economy is going to be stable. Maybe they're concerned about a recession coming, or they think that the government isn't doing a good job of keeping the economy under control. They just, for whatever reason, they don't trust this country with their money right now. They think that bad things are about to happen there. That's what would happen with capital outflow. And then, of course, demand will also be affected by some things. Households are going to affect demand anytime they do interest-sensitive spending. This is when people, like you and me, buy things that we need a loan for. So that could be like a car or a house, or if we want to buy a boat, something like that. You're not going to see this that often, although it can occur. That's not what we're worried about. For firms and businesses, this is what we're worried about. Businesses are going to borrow money to conduct what we call interest-sensitive investment spending. Alright, businesses are going to do interest-sensitive investment spending whenever the real interest rate is low enough that they feel that they can get a good return on investment. So this is going to be when businesses buy capital goods in order to increase production. And it's going to be called interest-sensitive investment spending. If investment spending increases, well, the demand for loans is going to increase because these are capital goods, million-dollar machines that you're going to have to take out a loan to buy. If interest-sensitive investment spending is decreasing, well, then the demand of loanable funds is going to shift to the left. If they're not buying capital goods, well, they're not going to need a loan for them. Next, we have the government. The government is going to change this. The government is going to affect the loanable funds market for demand in one way, essentially. If the government does deficit spending, that means that the taxes are low and government spending is high, and they're doing deficit spending. They're essentially spending money that they don't have. In order to do that, they're going to have to demand or increase demand for loanable funds by issuing government bonds. And when that happens, they drive up the real interest rate. And if the real interest rate goes up because the government's borrowing money, businesses are likely to stop borrowing money, and this is called This is called crowding out. If crowding out is happening, that means businesses are no longer demanding loans, and they're not demanding loans because the government borrowed money and drove up the real interest rate. Generally, this is going to happen during a recession because you'd want low taxes and high government spending, which will drive up the real interest rate. Crowding out, though, is bad You don't want this to happen. This is when businesses are not going to investment spend. So that's going to affect our long run economic growth. You don't want the real interest rate being high because of the government, because then you're going to have businesses not investing anymore. And next year or 5 years from now, we might have lower economic growth because of it. All right, for the first example, what happens if there's an increase in household savings? Well, remember, savings affects the supply curve. So if there's an increase in household savings, then there's an increase in the supply of loanable funds, aka the amount of money that can actually be loaned out. So an increase is going to be a shift to the right. We have an increase in the supply of loanable funds. And now, what really matters is our real interest rate has decreased. It is now cheaper to borrow money. This is going to be good for the economy because now businesses will be able to take out loans to increase their investment spending on capital goods. And if that happens, well, then we can maybe experience economic growth in the future, depending on how much they're actually spending. If their net investment spending is increasing, then we might have that production possibility curve shift out to the right, or that long-run aggregate supply curve shift out to the right. All right, for a second practice problem, we're going to look at what happens if there is a decrease in investment spending. If there's a decrease in investment spending, what we mean is that businesses are going to stop buying capital goods. Remember these $1 million machines that allow them to produce? So if they stop buying capital goods, they're not going to need loans anymore. And so if they're not buying capital goods, the demand curve for loanable funds will decrease and shift to the left. Now that they're not buying capital goods, it is now cheaper to borrow money because the demand decreases for it. Well then, just like a regular old supply and demand graph, the price goes down. And the real interest rate is just the price of borrowing money. All right, for the next one. What if there's an increase in deficit spending? Remember, deficit spending is when the government is lowering taxes but increasing government spending. Generally, you're going to do this during a recession to try to get out. If we are deficit spending, that means the government is spending money that they don't have. And in order to spend money that they don't have, they have to borrow it. So the demand curve will shift to the right. Our real interest rate will increase. It is now more expensive to borrow money. And remember, a bad thing about this is that now that the real interest rate went up because the government borrowed money, your investment spending is going to go down. It's going to cost too much for businesses to borrow right now and invest in capital goods, so they're going to stop borrowing, and that's called crowding out. When the government borrowing money causes businesses to stop borrowing money. And this is bad because it can stunt our economic growth. And finally, a budget surplus. If the government's in a budget surplus, that means that our taxes are going to be high and our spending's going to be low. If that's the case, then the government actually has more money sitting around that they don't know what to do with. And they're not just going to put it under some mattress in the Lincoln bedroom. What they're going to do is put it in the bank. And so a government budget surplus is going to lead to an increase in the supply of loanable funds. Because remember, supply is your savings, demand is your borrowers. So supply is going to increase and shift to the right. This is going to cause, that arrow looks weird. This is going to cause a decrease in the real interest rate. Now that the real interest rate is decreased, it's going to be cheaper to borrow money. Businesses are going to be happy about that. This will probably lead to an increase in the purchasing of capital goods, so an increase in investment spending, which could lead to economic growth in the future.